Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm Platoon Leader Al Spry. We're going to be talking with former Senator Jim DeMint about his new book, Falling in Love with America Again.
Jim is now the head of the Heritage Foundation, and they have crisscrossed the country to find these positive stories of America and tell us about many things that are right with the country instead of all what's wrong. Stay tuned. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm raconteur and all-about guy Al Spry. Nice to chat with you, Reagan.
Always a pleasure to share these quarters with you, sir. And a little bit later in the hour, we're going to be joined by former U.S. Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina, who has a lot to say about the country.
Yes, he's minty fresh. He is ready to talk.
Yeah.
One thing I like about Jim DeMint is that he left of his own will after he served what he said he was going to serve.
Yeah.
Unlike other people that have gone to Congress that have said they will only serve a certain amount of terms and then ran again and changed their minds. Right. So I like that about him. I don't agree with everything he says, but I like him. He's a patriot.
Yeah.
And I like patriots. Okay. You can watch us on Tough TV.
Yes, the
Florida Roundtable, right. Tough TV 38. We are on 3 times a week. Wednesdays at 9 a.m., Saturdays at 9 a.m., and if you didn't get enough, Sundays at 9 a.m. Right here on Tough TV 38. You can get us over the air with an HD antenna. You can buy them at Radio Shack, of course, in select apartment complexes, and on the Summit Broadband cable TV system. And if you can't get our programming, call your cable or satellite provider and say, I want my Tough TV.
There you go.
Otherwise, I'm going to get mad. Now, this is an interesting thing, just talking about the changing demographics of America, but right here in Florida. The House approved in-state tuition for some undocumented students. Now, undocumented, illegal alien, however term you want to use, some are more politically loaded than others, but this is a sea change. The Hispanic community in America and in Florida is growing rapidly. And these issues are important to the Hispanic community. So, what do we have? Politics is local. The Republicans hailed as a historic moment. The Republicans reaching out to Hispanics, Hispanic Americans. Florida House voted 81-33 to allow undocumented students to pay in-state tuition rates at Florida colleges and universities. But challenges remain ahead. The Senate version of the proposal, which is SB 1400, was nearly defeated in its first committee stop. It must now be heard by the Senate Education Appropriations Subcommittee. The chair of that subcommittee, Senator Bill Galvano, Republican in Bradenton, opposes the measure, said he hasn't yet decided whether to take up the bill. This is important because unless the Republican Party changes its tune on certain issues that are especially those that are important to a growing constituency, they are going to continue to be, like I've said and like you've said in the past, the party of old white angry men.
Well, that's right. If we go back a few years when Jeb Bush was the governor of this state, and even when George W. was the president of the United States, if you look at their election results, both of the brothers did much better in Hispanic voters than anybody in Florida or the country has done since in the Republican Party.
Absolutely. And if you look at Jeb Bush, he's married to a Colombian lady. He has kids that are biracial. And, of course, this all plays into this is a new way of looking at things. And you can't keep doing the same old things. You can't keep playing to the same segment of your populace and the same voter segment if the voter segment is changing. It's politics, but it's also realistic.
By the way, I didn't mention a couple of weeks ago, there's a new generation of Bushes out there. And Jeb Bush has a son, George P. Bush, and he recently won the Republican nomination to be the land commissioner of the state of Texas, which probably means come November he will be elected.
Yeah, the Bush name still carries some weight, as well as the Clinton name.
But he chose to leave Florida and go to Texas.
But he chose to go to Texas. Yeah, that's very interesting because he was born and raised here in Florida.
Yeah.
So we'll. It's either Florida or Texas, Ray. What is it with the Bushes?
I don't know.
It's either Florida or Texas. I don't know. I personally, if I didn't have to hear about any more Bushes or Clintons, it wouldn't be too soon. I think they've had their time in the limelight. I think we don't need these, multi-generational
time to move on.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of kings and royalty in America, and based on a name, and that's not really American to me. I don't like it. Didn't like it with the Kennedys. I don't think it's appropriate with the Bushes or Clintons.
Harry Truman used to say, he said, "I did what I wanted to do. I had my turn. Now I need to get out of the way and give somebody else a chance."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you don't hear about the Truman family.
No, that's right.
That, So,
alrighty. Well, let us pause along the network line. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Regan Smith,
and I'm Al Spry,
and we'll continue our conversation with Senator Jim DeMint as the program continues. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Regan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined on the long-distance line this day by South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint. He's been here before. We're delighted to have him back. In the interim, the senator has become the head of the Heritage Foundation. And, Senator, welcome back to the Florida Roundtable.
Reagan, Al, it's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure, sir. For those who may not remember, how about taking the first minute or so and go ahead and tell us about your political career and how you ended up at the Heritage Foundation?
Well, I never expected to be in politics. I was a small businessman in Greenville, South Carolina, and I'd never run for anything in my life until I got really frustrated with many things the government was doing. So when I was 47 years old, I ran for Congress. I think if you told me I was going to win, I might not have done it, but I ended up winning. And I limited my own term so that I wouldn't end up like the folks that I thought were doing the country harm. And I said it would be 6 years in the House, and then I would either run for something else or come back to my business. And I did that, but at the end of my 6-year term, I saw that the Senate was the biggest problem in Washington. I decided to run for the Senate, and again, I won. I limited myself to 2 terms, and I'd already announced that I was not going to run again after my second term. But I decided to leave even earlier than that because the country seemed to be going in the wrong direction, and Washington was not going to fix it. But I had seen if I leave Washington and work with people around the country to elect different people or to talk about different ideas, that I can have much more of an impact. And just like what happened in Florida, the Republican Party had decided on one candidate for Senate, but the people in Florida were interested in another person called Marco Rubio. And that's the kind of thing I saw around the country where the people, if they got engaged, could change things. And so I believe that that's where the battle is now in America, that we have to win the debate with the American people about the ideas that can make their life better and our country stronger, and encourage them to vote for themselves, to vote for those things that are going to make their life better. So I decided to leave. The Heritage Foundation is the centerpiece of the conservative movement in America. They do a lot of research to prove that their ideas actually work. It's not about political philosophy. It's about what really works. And so from that position at Heritage, we can help hundreds of organizations around the country to move this country in the right direction. And so I already see that happening. I'm encouraged, and I see people beginning to look up and compare what works with what doesn't. Compare Florida with Detroit, for instance, and economic growth. And so I wrote the book to remind people that America has always been different. We've been built from the ground up by individuals, innovators, entrepreneurs, little platoons, as Edmund Burke talks about. And as we replace those with central government, America doesn't work as well, and we become much more divided. and many people falling out of love with our country. So we need to fix those things that are broken, and most of that is moving power out of Washington.
Well, the name of your book is Falling in Love with America. Again, I was just talking to somebody recently about the teachers and how a lot of teachers who should be teachers they get out of it. And you're one of the guys who should be a senator, and you got out of it. But I understand you wanted to change it from without, and I think that you can do that because, of course, people still have the vote. And, of course, people can still vote the right people in if they so choose, and they're so educated. I think a lot of it has to do with education. I think many people are led to the voting booth by slick ads and not much substance, and maybe that's because we've seen a gradual, quote-unquote, dumbing down of the nation over the last 50 years due to television and other media that's not stimulating people. It's more about slick, and it's more about how people look. I wanted to get your take on that.
That's part of it, but another part of it is the consultants know that if they make campaigns really negative, that a lot of good people don't even want to be involved with it. And what you see is a lot of people have checked out of politics. They don't vote. You've only got about 40% of Americans over 18 who are actually voting. And many of those people are folks who just don't want anything from government. They want to be free. But what's changing in America is people are seeing that if they don't get involved, that the government will begin to take away not only their money, what they work for, but their freedoms to make their own decisions, or to put their children in schools that work, or for states to develop their own economies and energy. So I think you see now that Americans are alarmed at the direction of Washington. They don't necessarily know what to do or who to vote for because both parties have been involved with making Washington bigger. So we have to look for a particular kind of candidate, and sometimes the party label doesn't help. But the good news is this, is issues that used to divide, like school choice. Florida really set the pace for more choices of schools. The evidence is in. The people who benefit the most are poor minority children. So what we're seeing now are folks who used to oppose choice, who used to vote different ways, are now beginning to help with this issue, and that's a uniting factor. When a family can get a child in a good school, that it helps them fall in love with America again.
Senator, you remind me of Ronald Reagan, who one of his favorite sayings over the years was the most feared words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah, and it's not being anti-government. The federal government was never intended to do all the things that it can do. And I did a lot of consulting with major companies when I had my own company. And we just learned, and American companies have learned, that central management, central top-down ideas don't work nearly as well as ideas that come from the ground up, from the shop floor, from the customers. And it's an idea that always worked in America when it was less centralized. So government has a role. Federal government needs to protect our country, and we need to look around the world and see how dangerous it's gotten and stop playing these games and develop a good missile defense system and make sure that we can protect our citizens. We don't need to be running schools in Washington. 50 states need to be competing for the best schools and the best health care system and the best energy development system. And these things are working. I lay all this out in the book. Falling in Love with America, again, is not a book about political theory. It's story after story of Americans who are helping each other in these little platoons that Edmund Burke said were the beginning of public affection and love for our fellow man.
What was your criteria as you put the book together and you selected these stories? There probably were way too many for the number of pages the publisher says they want. What kind of criteria did you use in putting it together?
Well, we wanted to cover all the issues that the people in Washington think they need to solve from Washington, whether it be education or the environment, energy development, health care. We've got stories from all over the country of citizens who are actually solving those problems in a much better way that not only save money, but they're more effective, and they create more of a sense of community rather than resentment and a sense of entitlement or dependency. I feel like a lot of federal programs have people in dependency and make it hard for them to get off and get hard for them to get a job. And we've got stories like Step 13 in Denver. This was just a guy who had been a drug addict himself, who started a program to help people get off of drugs or off of alcohol, to help them get a job and some job training. And once they did, they got more training, they got better jobs, and the story just follows it through to where they buy a house and start a family. And these were people who had no chance in the world. And you compare that with federal programs that often create more poverty, create more addiction. The whole first chapter is about a man named Bob Woodson who came up the hard way himself, and he's going around the country finding these little platoons that are working in the inner city and giving them some support. And what the whole point here is, if we support those things that work, instead of sending more and more money and decision-making to Washington, we can quickly turn our country around and make life better for people.
I agree. I think that the best politics, of course, is on the local level. When you start having an overarching federal government, of course, Reagan, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, and here's what I've seen, some very troubling things over the last 13, 14 years is, of course, abridgment of freedoms after 9/11, Patriot Act, which I don't consider very patriotic. I don't want to get your take on that. And then follow it up with the crash of 2008. And we saw all these big banks playing fast and loose with the rules. Of course, no one was held accountable. We saw nobody go to jail. We saw no trials. Everything just kind of went back to status quo. And this is also very troubling to me. We had a gentleman on talking about crony capitalism not too long ago and the soft fascism that's evident now. And so I wanted to get your take on each of these, and I think we're on the same page when it comes to that.
Well, I've got a few chapters on the big banks, and crony capitalism is weaved throughout this. And I do it to help people understand that big government, is not helping the little guy. And the bailouts from the Wall Street crash is one of the best examples, because the banks had a lot to do with bringing down our economy.
Absolutely.
And yet when the doors closed and the Dodd-Frank legislation was written supposedly to help the little guy, what it did is it bailed out Wall Street and actually made it harder for companies to compete with them. And it made this too big to fail something that was codified in law. Mm-hmm. And now community banks are having very much difficulty dealing with the regulations. They didn't cause the problems, but many small businesses went out of business. They didn't get a bailout, and it happens all the time. The big companies cause the problems. They get a carve-out for themselves when the legislation is written to fix the problem, and then they get the benefit. And the same things happen with Obamacare. It was not designed for the uninsured little guy. It was written by the big insurance companies,
yes,
big hospitals, and they were looking to force people into a healthcare system and to buy plans they didn't need. And it was about big government, and the same with education. You've got citizens who are starting schools that we can prove work and help poor children get a chance, but the teachers' unions are working with the big government to shut them down, not just in New York, but the president closed down the D.C. scholarship program. We had to open it back up, and it's a constant fight with the bigs. And so if Americans will just look up and say, I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat, if they're saying they're going to solve our problems from Washington, don't vote for them. If somebody happens to run and say, what we're going to do is move more decision-making and more dollars back to Florida, let us do more with our schools and our energy development. Let us do more with our healthcare system here, working with other states. And the book is about these things actually working, but it's hard for them to work if the federal government is creating incentives for it to go the other way.
Senator, on that note, we need to take a pause along our network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of TV 38. I'm Regan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Jim DeMint, former Senator of South Carolina, now the head of the Heritage Foundation. We are discussing his new book, Falling in Love with America Again, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And our conversation continues in a moment. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Regan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina. He is now the head of the Heritage Foundation, and he's got a brand new book, Falling in Love with America Again. And it is available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Senator, when you decided you were going to put this together, how long did it take you to collect all of these stories and get it together?
Well, I actually started when I was in the Senate working on weekends with a colleague of mine who was helping me put together the stories about the bigs and crony capitalism. It started with a book about what was wrong with America, and when I went to the Heritage Foundation, I realized the country doesn't need another book about what's wrong. We need a book about what's working. Mm-hmm. And so we sat down with some people at Heritage and started collecting the stories from all over the country, because the Heritage folks work with people in every state on every issue. And the title at that time was From the Ground Up, because we were going to talk about the things that worked, but mostly talk about crony capitalism and the bigs. But we switched that all the way around as we talked about what was working in America and all the stories of the people in the little platoons that were actually making America better. We just all fell in love with the country again as we talked about it and realized that was really the story that we wanted to tell. So on every issue, every chapter is a different issue with lots of stories of individuals. Like the first chapter is Bob Woodson, who started in one community after dealing with a lot of issues himself, identifying some people who were helping children, helping the community, and then he started working in communities all over the country, raising money to get the resources for those things that were working. And that's what our government should do, is if something's working, to not replace it, but to try to make it work better, either by getting out of the way or leaving more money in the state so the state can help do that. But it was a wonderful process. It helped me get to know a lot of the people at the Heritage Foundation and what they were doing here and all over the country. So it was a good process, and I think that we've gotten good input, good feedback as the book is being read around the country. People seem to think it is optimistic. It helps us realize that we can turn things around, that we don't need to throw in the towel on this country because all the answers are right in front of our face.
Well, and I'd like to hit this angle with you. As far as jobs, everybody's interested in jobs. How do we get more jobs? How do we create more jobs? There's a lot of talk bantered around Washington about jobs, but nobody really does anything, as you know. You could trace this, I think, to a lack of ethics and morals that has somehow permeated every facet of business and trickled down to the community and the individual level. Because if people can't govern themselves, government will govern them, right? So We've seen over the last 40 years, perhaps, we see companies shuttering plants. We see companies shuttering job places, sending things overseas. We've seen a march towards globalization, like it's the great God, of course. And we see, and of course, when those jobs go, those jobs are not coming back. People here in America want to work. I don't think people really want to be on assistance. I think people, it's in the American character, I think, to want to work. However, until people and companies are able to govern themselves appropriately, I don't see a change. But I wanted to get your take on that argument.
You're right. This has happened over several decades, and we need to look at what the process really was and how it worked. We've got people in Washington who are promising jobs and increasing minimum wage. We spent more on economic stimulus under this president than we ever have before, yet the economy is still growing less than 2% a year, which is not enough to give jobs to people who are coming up now, coming out of school. But what I do in the book is compare the things that are actually working, where jobs are being created. North Dakota is a state we use. North Dakota was basically a wasteland. No one would want to live there, but they used a new technology that was developed by an individual. It was not developed by the government. In fact, a lot of people in government have tried to oppose this concept of fracking, even though it has not demonstrated any pollution in our water or our air. In fact, bringing up natural gas is a third less polluting than coal or oil. But in North Dakota now, you've got a vibrant, growing economy. Thousands and thousands of families have now got a better way of life. We're providing more energy to our country. It makes us safer from a defense standpoint to not be dependent. And then you don't need minimum wage mandates, because you can start at McDonald's for $15 an hour when you've got a vibrant economy. And Florida is one of the examples of no income tax, a right-to-work state. Your economy has come back much faster than many other states. Texas has done more liability reform. It's attracting doctors. And so we know what works, and if you want to know what doesn't work and where the progressives are taking us, you just have to look at Detroit. And then Illinois is following close behind, a state that will probably be in bankruptcy. So that's what we're trying to do with the book, is say, forget the political philosophy, the political labels. Let's look at what's working. And I'm with you. I don't think Americans want to be in a dependent relationship with their government where they don't have self-esteem and a sense of accomplishment. But our programs trap people in these dependent welfare programs, Medicaid, and it's hard to get off. If you get a job, you lose benefits much quicker than you can get them from a new job. We need to make it easier for people to get off and to earn their own living, but we have to allow the economy to grow, and you can't do it the way this president's doing, with more taxes, more regulations. We just have to look up and see. We've got too many people voting for folks who are hurting them. They're voting for people who are hurting them. And if we can just get people to look at what makes this country work and stop buying these ideas that big government's going to help the little guy, I can guarantee you, big government helps the big, rich guy, despite what they say, despite which party's in power. If we want to solve the problems, move money back to the states. It won't be perfect, but it'll be a lot better than it is.
And once you give these entitlements to people, the federal government creates, and they call them entitlements, it's very, very difficult to ever get them back or to put a cap on them or reduce them. That's a big problem.
It is. And the only real entitlements are Social Security and Medicare, because they've been paid for. And I would say also military benefits, because they've certainly been worked for. But the welfare programs, Medicaid, I mean, this is public charity, and we need to recognize that. And what we have now is the way it's set up is states benefit from promoting food stamps, Medicaid, because they don't pay all the tab, particularly with food stamps and disability. It's paid for by the federal government. So you've got people now at the state level who are actually promoting government dependency because they feel like it brings money back to their states. But some states, there are a lot of states now who are realizing that the federal government is hurting them in many ways, hurting their schools, hurting their health care system. And we've got states that are starting to break away, push back against the Obamacare, push back against the energy development bans. So that's the best movement that could possibly happen in America, is if states come together and start pushing back against more federal control.
I wanted to...
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Just quickly before we go to break, I know that we're talking about, of course, positive stories, and I wanted to commend you on your book. because we need more positivity. We need positive solutions in order to solve these problems. Pointing fingers at each other, I don't think is going to do it. And I think there's been too much of that where people are separated. Because when you separate people based on race or gender or socioeconomic status, they point fingers to each other, and then the people at the top laugh at them. And there's nothing that's done to correct the situation, you see.
Senator, hold on to that thought, because we do need to pause again along our network line here. Let us remind folks that they're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks in the Orlando area. We're also on TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina. He is now the head of the Heritage Foundation, and we're talking about his brand new book, Falling in Love with America Again. And if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area of TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
It's great to be on Tough TV. I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day is South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint. He is now the head of the Heritage Foundation, and they have a marvelous new book out, Falling in Love with America Again. It's from Center Street Publishers. It's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Senator, thank you so very much for taking all this time out of your busy schedule. We know that they do keep you very busy, and we appreciate you being with us today.
Oh, well, it's been fun to talk about our country and talk about what makes us love this country. And I think if we do more of that, folks will really fall in love with America again.
Well, Reagan and Senator DeMint, I want to kind of keep a thread from the last segment, and that is there's still time to save this country. But I really think we're at a crossroads here. We're at a crossroads between freedom and what you would refer to I don't want to throw the word slavery bannering around because people want to make light of that, but when I talk about slavery versus freedom, I'm talking about we'll either keep our rights and live as free people, or we're going to be under the yoke of I'm just going to say it, a fascist government. I don't want to use that term too lightly, but I think we are headed that way. Totalitarianism, as you know, wears different clothing. Sometimes it's red, as in communism. Sometimes it's the fascism of a corporate corporate governmental partnership that's keeping everybody oppressed. So, and the way that they do that is they pit people against each other. I know you wanted to make this point before we have to end the interview, and I wanted to give you the opportunity, Senator. When you keep people opposed to each other, when you keep people at odds with each other, I'm talking about the American people, then, of course, the status quo, the governmental structure that's existing right now, the corporate governmental structure, which is oppressive and totalitarian in nature, gets to walk and laugh all the way to the bank. So I wanted to get your take.
They do. I think this administration may have been the worst in my lifetime at dividing people and using it to empower themselves, convincing us that we're actually opposed to each other, when in fact the most encouraging thing to me is last year I was probably in 70 or 80 cities, and we met with so many different people. And when you take the political labels off, folks agree on so many things. They want to be free. They don't want to force their opinions on other people. But what happens with big government is not only do they divide us, but then they start forcing all of us into one-size-fits-all solutions and forcing our children into the same schools when they don't work for everyone, forcing us all in the same healthcare system, and creating these one-size-fits-all energy blockades and financial management and control. And what happens is people begin to resent the coercion of government, and then they resent other people. We resent if we're forced to participate in some activity we think is wrong. Otherwise, we could live with folks that we disagree with, even on moral issues. But once we're forced by government, we start resenting our government, and we start resenting those we disagree with. The way to solve that is the way America always solved it. We were a melting pot, but we were a melting pot of people who could make their own decisions about the way they lived, about what they believed. And it was never perfect in our country, but we were much more united in the principles that unite us. And it still happens around the country, but politics is dividing by saying we need to do one thing for everybody. That is the most divisive thing that can happen. And so the concept of rebuilding America from the ground up with little platoons and people making their own decisions is the original American idea. It's not a political idea. So I encourage people with the book, if you want to love each other and love the country, don't go for these one-size-fits-all solutions. Centralize things, push them back to the states, to the communities, to the small platoons, and get the federal government focused on defending our country and ensuring justice, but not trying to run every aspect of our life. That's very divisive, and as if you look at history, it always ends badly.
I think you got a very strong point there, too. And a lot of what you were saying caused me to think back to the days of the Great Depression and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the overarching government doing too much and killing off private charities. And they said we don't repeat our mistakes and don't do the things over again. I don't know. I read that and have a hard time with it.
Well, just look at the Roman Empire and the empires that followed.
That's exactly right. Well, Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina, now the head of the Heritage Foundation. His new book, Falling in Love with America Again, from Center Street Publishers, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Senator, thank you for all your time this day, and we do hope that you come back and do this with us again soon.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for what you do every day. You're a little platoon making a difference yourself.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Jim DeMint. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a closing thought following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area on Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. Reagan.
And it was a pleasure to have Senator Jim DeMint with us. Last time he was here, he was still actually a senator. Now, we probably should be saying former senator, but we know once you have the title, you're entitled to be called that.
Yes.
He is now the chief executive officer of the Heritage Foundation think tank in the Washington area. Yeah.
All right. Well, it was great to have him on. Let's talk about this interesting development. Florida's Bright Futures Scholarship Program, very popular program in Florida, is now under investigation by the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Whenever you hear civil rights.
Wow.
Here's the story. There's a move that could reignite long-simmering complaints about the fairness of the program. We're getting some flack here that an outsized share of the more than $4 billion in scholarships has gone to white or affluent families, at least some of whom were wealthy enough to afford college without any additional help. In recent years, state lawmakers concerned about rising costs of the program changed the standards to make the scholarships even harder to get, raising the minimum SAT and ACT test scores. And, of course, critics charge that this will only further exclude poor and minority students. Bright Futures, from its inception, has always been race, gender, and creed blind, according to State Representative Eric Friesen. Whoever reaches the highest GPA and SAT scores receives the scholarship, but the recent changes appear to have jump-started a dormant probe many thought defunct. So the Office for Civil Rights would discuss few details of the ongoing investigation, but acknowledged it requested information about Bright Futures last year from some Florida schools, including Miami-Dade.
What I hear about Bright Futures you may find to be interesting.
Yes.
Teaching at the University of Central Florida, almost every semester, invariably, when we get to the point where there's only 1 or 2 weeks left in the term, a student will email me or come to me and say, isn't there anything I can do to improve my grade? Because if I don't get this or that, I'm going to lose my bright future. They wait until maybe there's 6 classes left, right, and then want to know how they can fix their grade so they don't lose their bright future. Right. Obviously, Mom and Dad weren't watching that one very close.
No. Talk about Too late, too little, too late a lot of times.
Yeah. Speaking of which, it's time for us to run up the white flag and call this a show today, Al. Clock does run when we get involved in these conversations. It is a great pleasure for me. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we'll see you again in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.